Wow. Thank you, Soleil. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, that kind of makes me sort of step into a big role here. Beautiful, but thank you. Yeah, some of the things that Soleil said are so true, in the sense that, yeah, I did try to retire for a while, but I did come back, and part of the coming back was because Karen, who Soleil mentioned, did pass on unexpectedly, and there was a need to be filled, and it was a time also of great change in the yoga therapy profession in the world. And over 31 years, I have seen a lot of change, and it's funny because what we're about is change. And one of the things that's coalesced for me so clearly in the last few years, and was reinforced in the presentation from John Weeks, that in this day and age, those of us who are serious about contributing something of meaning and value in the healthcare industry really are about change. We're change agents. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit with you tonight about. It's just about the whole process of change. And some of the things that have coalesced for me recently, fairly recently, in the last few years. Back 31 years ago, we just basically did what we did. And I did it mostly because it worked. I'll tell you a little story about that in a little bit. But fundamentally, we did it without really knowing why it worked, how it worked. And to be quite honest, I didn't really want to spend a whole lot of time trying to figure that part out, because I knew that when I worked with people, it served them, it really helped them, it made a difference to their life. So why did I need to know any more, other than that this is good and it works? And so blindly went on doing that for a lot of years, but now in the last few years, research, neuroscience, a whole lot of other things are telling us not only why it works, but how it works, and even more so, they're telling us that we're right on track in terms of what we're doing to help people change. So that's the topic for tonight, yoga therapy for change. And there are 4 areas that I want to explore a bit: the intersection of yoga, mindfulness, neuroscience, and psychology. All of those things intersect, and in where they intersect for us, we draw elements from each of them, and where those elements intersect is really what our work is about. So to begin with, I've always been, and I didn't realize this until fairly recently either, but I've always been a change addict. Always been wanting to change myself and to help other people with that. And it's funny because right from when I was a kid, I used to teach people how to do things because I want them to get to learn something or to grow or to change. And that continued. And there I was in Australia in about the early 1980s. And at that point, I'd reached the pinnacle of one career. I'd had a tenured professorship at a college. I was helping to run the college and had an academic standing and secure job for life. Lived in a beautiful part of the city of Adelaide. Everything was fine. Family, house, great. But I wasn't happy. And I wasn't happy because I wasn't fulfilled, I guess, at a soul level. There was something missing. The whole education scene then, and I'm sure it is still today in many ways, was very bureaucratic. And so I'd spent a lot of time going to meetings to kind of justify why I wanted to teach the way I did, or do this course or that course or whatever. And I thought, I really think there's something more. And I looked for that more, and what happened was I started to connect with people outside the realm of my comfort zone. And one particular place I went was an ashram where there was a couple of swamis, SΑDHANA lineage, and they were coming to the college to do some adult learning courses, and I kind of got to know them, and they invited me to come along and do some morning practices with them and so forth. And that was very satisfying, and I thought, this is great. And so I started to do the practices at home every day. I'd kind of get down on the mat and do some yoga practices, and I do some pranayama, and even did the meditation with the candle flame, and did that for quite a while. My daughter at that time said to me one day, she said, "Dad, I like when you do that stuff." I said, how come? She said, well, when you do that stuff, you're not as grumpy as you usually are. And that was almost like hit me between the eyes. It was like, wow, here I am, I'm teaching change. That was basically my profession, organizational behavioral change. And here I am changing myself just by doing a few simple things, and my daughter noticing it. And that was a problem that I had too in my work, because I noticed that we'd run these wonderful courses based on a lot of the new technology, a lot of the stuff that was coming out of Tavistock in England, coming out of Esalen just up the road here, a lot of the sort of humanistic psychology. And people were learning these great things, but it wasn't really changing much. They'd go back to their environment, it was the same old, because the environment hasn't changed. And at a fundamental level, at a visceral level, they hadn't changed either. They'd got some new ideas, they had some great thoughts, and they'd had some great awareness, but had they really changed? So I thought, I got to find out more about this stuff. So I left Australia, got a sabbatical. I applied for a sabbatical very, very boldly. I thought, I'm going to apply and ask if I can take a year off to study Eastern and Western methods of bringing about change. And sure enough, I got the award and was able to leave for a year, and decided to go live in an ashram. In those days, some of you have probably heard of Kripalu. It's pretty big now. Has anyone been there, Kripalu? Okay, yeah, a lot of you. So back in 1984, it was an ashram. And they happened to have a program where it was combined with an independent study master's degree program through Norwich University in Vermont. And I decided, wow, that's for me. I can have an excuse for being there by doing a study, writing a paper, and doing some research. And I can use myself as a self-study. I can use myself as kind of like what happens to me while I live in an ashram for a year. And it was a great idea, and it worked. But of course, one of the things that happened was by the end of the year came, I didn't really want to do anything else. I was hooked. And so I stayed on. But during that year, I had an experience, and that's the part that I want to tell you about before I get into the next thing. And that experience was that we would get together, with other people, and I was really into yoga and assisted yoga postures and different ways in which the body and mind connected, and breath and all that kind of thing. And so I was working with one of my friends, a guy called Don Stapleton. Some of you may have heard of him. And he and I used to get together, and we'd do different assists with each other and play with different ideas around yoga therapy. We were doing that one day, and I was against a wall, and I was in the triangle pose. And I was at that place where normally, if I was doing it by myself, I would have said, okay, that's enough, next posture. Because I was at that edge, that place of discomfort where it's not too much, but something's going on and it doesn't feel so good. And so I was at that place. And when I think back on it and I look at it, and I did fairly soon after this experience, it wasn't like a physical edge. It wasn't like this is too painful to be here. But I was at that place where not only was there a physical edge of some kind, but there was also something else happening. And the other thing that was happening was there was emotions coming up, and a lot of mixed emotions. Anxiety, fear, sadness, joy, exhilaration, bliss, all mixed in together. So it's kind of weird, but it was weird enough to say, this is unusual, this is unfamiliar, I'll back off. But he put his hand on my chest and he said, why don't you just stay there and breathe? And so I did. I felt the connection of the hand on my chest, and I felt, wow, that feels good. And I relaxed a little, and I breathed a little more, and I hung in with it. And at that point, it kind of melded all of these mixed emotions into a feeling of everything's okay. And at the same time, there was something there, more to reveal itself, but I didn't really know what it was. But it wasn't in a hurry. And it was almost like a sense of timelessness. And then I started to have a few images and feelings, different feelings. And one of the images that was very clear was being in a school playground about 8 years old and getting beaten up by some bigger kids, the school bullies, And I thought, okay. And I just noticed that. I didn't get upset by it, but just noticed it and let it pass and took a few more breaths, and then I came out of the posture. And I felt a little shaky, a little insecure, a little like vulnerable, as though something had happened and I wasn't quite sure what it was, but it felt pretty good. But Don had to go off to a meeting, so he said, "You're on your own, buddy." I know you had a bit of an experience there, but you're on your own. I said, okay. So I went back to my room, and I was really good at journaling at those days. I used to journal every day. So I pulled out the journal and I started to write. I started to write about this 8-year-old. And then I read what I'd written. And when I read it, it just struck me very clearly. I was afraid of big people. And I'd been afraid of big people pretty much from that time when I was 8 until that day at around probably 30-something. I can't remember how old I was, but late 30s probably. And I'd conducted my life where I divided my world into 2 sets of people. The safe people who were not big. And by not big, they didn't have any power. They were kind of the downtrodden, the kind of people who were marginal or, not really leaders, because leaders were scary. Leaders might make a decision that would affect me and I'd have to defend or justify. And I noticed that it had been like this in my work career. I'd gotten reasonably far, but only because I'd played it safe. I hadn't done it because I'd taken a stand with big people. And I thought, maybe that has even limited me in some ways. I don't know. But it was a question. But it was this noticing that I'd done this, but also feeling at a visceral level that something had changed. And I noticed for the next few days as I'd walk down the hallways, I wasn't looking at big people the same way. I was actually smiling and engaging and connecting and getting along with them. I thought, wow, that's strange. I haven't really done anything to change that, but it's happening. And it was very gratifying. So as a result of that experience, several things led from that. One of which was to say, this has been a pretty powerful experience for me. So I started to play with it and try it out with other people, other brothers in the ashram, that were having stuff happening. I'd say, try this, we'd get together and I'd try and replicate kind of what had happened. I figured out pretty quickly that you couldn't kind of replicate it. Everyone was different, but there were certain elements that were similar. So I found different ways to reproduce the elements. And what I noticed was people would have experiences. They would have experiences that were different, but that were meaningful, very meaningful and very powerful. There was something happened when you got to that place where you could just drop in and let go. And so I thought, okay, this is worth doing more with. And so I did. So basically, what I figured out recently, I didn't know this at the time, but there were really 4 areas that I was really drawing from. And if you think about my story, you think about some of the elements that were in it. And I'll just invite you now to call them out. Like, what were some of the things that made it possible for me to get there? What do you reckon? Hanging in there, yeah. The touch was important, yes. Letting go, relaxing, yes, definitely. Breath was very important, yeah. Being aware in the moment, mindful, yeah, absolutely. And somebody else witnessing in a certain way. And this was really important. I wasn't being judged. I wasn't being told what to do. I wasn't being given a prescription. I was basically being allowed to be wherever I was in that moment. So I looked at this, and when we look at it, these 4 areas all had something to do with it. There was yoga philosophy involved, psychology, mindfulness from the Buddhist kind of tradition, and there was also neuroscience, although it took a long time, many years before I even knew about this thing. So let's just look at some of those. And some of these you'll see were probably in this experience. The 8 limbs of yoga, all right? And if we go back even further to yoga, particularly when we talk about change, right? And I think yoga is all about change, because when you go back right to the Vedic era, those of you who studied yoga philosophy know about the Vedas, the Rig Veda, starting with that and going all the way through, right? What were those Vedic people doing, standing around the fire at in nighttime, chanting and doing rituals and stuff like that? What was that all about? They were trying to figure out how to pass on to the next generation what worked as far as creating a more meaningful and satisfying life was concerned. That's really where they're coming from. They were coming from a place of wanting to help support change. And if you go through the yoga philosophy path and you get to the Bhagavad Gita, story about change, story about dealing with dilemmas, and how do you figure it out? How do you be present in a way that will bring about a positive outcome, or an outcome that is in alignment with a sense of inner well-being? And then you get to Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. Again, we've got a whole set of directions around how to support change, particularly in relation to the mind. A lot of stuff, a lot of mind stuff in the Yoga Sutras. Calming the fluctuations of the mind. And then come, of course, the 8 limbs, the do's and the don'ts. So you've got to kind of be conducting your life on a pretty, okay sort of plane. You can't be going off off in all kinds of directions and expect positive change to happen. So there's certain things you have to do and not do to create some stability. Okay, and then you've got to take care of your body. Asana is important. Being engaged physically. And in this particular experience that I related to you, we're in an asana, no question about it. Okay, breath was in there. He was encouraging me to breathe, and I was using the breath as a way of helping to support being there. Pratyahara was there. Got to the point of sensation where I would normally run away from it. Instead of doing that, no, go right into it. Go into the sensation, and by going into it, transcend to the other side of it. Okay? And then, of course, when I dropped in, these elements came into being. And when I felt the bliss, probably a little taste of samadhi. It's okay. There's no problem here. It just is what it is, and it was timeless. So, a lot of connections there. And it was probably no coincidence that I was living in an ashram for 6 or 7 months before this happened. All right? I was prepared in some way. What I also learned was that around about 2,500 years ago, the Buddha came along and he took a little bit of a right turn from the yogic path, but was still a yogi. He was basically a yogi. He went off in the forest when he realized there was a lot of suffering in the world. He wanted to help alleviate the suffering. So he set out on a quest to do that.